Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com where you can find in-depth reporting and other resources concerning every topic you'll hear discussed on this podcast. Brought to you today by the San Antonio Express News. This month marks the 15th anniversary of the Iraq War, and to discuss this important piece of history, I'm joined now by someone who was there. San Antonio Express News senior reporter Sig Christenson, who was embedded with the 3rd Infantry Division during the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. Sig's Iraq-related Express News projects include Witness to War, a special section recounting the invasion and early occupation of Iraq, The Only Retreat, a 3-part series detailing the sole U.S. defeat during the invasion, as well as stories on soldier and family stress resulting from repeated deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, also including the story we're discussing today called Ex-POW Looks for Fresh Start 15 Years After Iraq. So, Sig, that's the longest intro I've ever done here for someone on the podcast, and it is very well deserved. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's been a long road.
I'm sure it has. Let's talk about it. You're here on the podcast to specifically discuss that article I just mentioned, Ex-POW Looks for Fresh Start 15 Years After Iraq, that is available right now on our website, expressnews.com. It's talking about former POWs who are now dealing with mental and physical consequences of being captured during the Iraq War, and we're going to talk about that here in a moment. That's why you're here. But first, could you just briefly talk about the early days of the conflict? This is now the 15-year anniversary, and as I mentioned, how you yourself came to be there to report on it.
Well, I was one of, I think it was maybe 87 or so embeds with the 3rd Infantry Division, and we were all spread out in various battalions and brigades. The division was on the western side of the country. The 1st Marine Expeditionary Force was on the east, and we pretty much closed on Baghdad like a claw, closing a little closer every day, headed through the desert, avoiding cities, generally speaking, but headed to the desert, trying to make it to Baghdad quickly, because it was believed that if we got there quickly, we could force the capitulation of the regime, and that it would probably be the least violent approach to it. We did not go into cities very often, and the reason why was because of concerns over high casualties and just the kind of messy nature that urban warfare always creates. And so this invasion lasted for 3 weeks. It was an enormous amount of territory to cover in a very short amount of time. And the unit I was with, Task Force 369 Armor, had 6 engagements, most of them major battles. The last one, a firefight outside of Baghdad with the Saddam Fedayeen, and that lasted about 30 minutes. There were 2 major battles prior to that at a place called Objective Peach, and those 2 battles basically defined the rest of the war. Once those battles were fought, and they ended in lopsided defeats for the Iraqi army, there was nothing to stop us from going to Baghdad, and that's exactly what we did. In fact, in less than 5 days, we were there. And a lot of folks will remember the Thunder Runs. That was the Army's effort to make sure everyone in Iraq knew that the war was over, that we owned the town. Well, we owned it for a few months, and then the insurgency really blew up, and from there on in, it was a pretty contested conflict. But that's how it started, and it was, without question, an American victory. But we only won the battle. We did not win the war.
And so we're going to get to this article here in a moment. Ex-POW Looks for Fresh Start 15 Years After Iraq. But as a broadcaster and reporter, Sig, I am just fascinated by all of these stories that you have just talked about and the multiple trips that you've made to the area, could you just talk about initially what was that decision like, or what was that opportunity like to go and become embedded during this military operation? Was this something that you actively sought? Was this something that was presented to you as an opportunity and you took advantage of that? How did that unfold?
It actually started early in 2001. The Bush administration had just taken over from the Clinton administration. And I was talking to a friend of mine who was a reporter for a national newspaper in the Pentagon. This may have been in February of 2001. I don't really remember exactly when, but he was telling me that there was talk in the Pentagon of invading Iraq. And I said, well, Dave, how could they possibly do that? We need to be attacked for that to happen. I was thinking upon the old way of war in this country, which is that the Americans are first attacked and then we go to war. When 9/11 occurred, I looked at my wife at the time and I said, I don't know how it's going to happen, but we're going to go to war in Iraq. And she said, what makes you say that? And I told her about the phone calls that I had been having. So I prepared for the Iraq war right after 9/11 began. I began working my contacts in Washington. I began going up to Fort Hood. I spent a lot of time with the 4th Infantry Division because I was told that they would be going to Iraq if there was a war. And it was, in fact, true. The 4th Infantry was supposed to be on the northern end of the war coming into Iraq from Turkey. Turkey would not allow it. So they ended up coming from the south, following the 3rd Infantry Division and the 101st Airborne, which also was in there. It's pretty interesting because how we ended up being embedded comes down to one of the more curious moments of chance that you'll ever ask for. The Houston Chronicle came along and asked my boss to give our embeds with the 4th Infantry Division to the Chronicle reporter and photographer. And they came back and said, we'll give you our 3rd Infantry Division slots. At the time, I was furious. I thought that was a real ripoff. It's not what I had wanted to report on. I wanted to talk about the Texas side of the war. Well, so did the Chronicle. But it turned out that we were with the right division. 3rd Infantry Division was the spearhead for the invasion, and the battalion that we were with, 369 Armor, happened to be one of the lead battalions in the fight almost all the way to Baghdad. So we literally had a front row seat to the war from the beginning to the end. And I was embedded with a group of people called TACPs, Tactical Air Control Parties. Those are Air Force specialists. They call in close air support. They literally tell the pilot when he can drop his bomb. And pilots have to follow the orders of the air controllers on the ground. So that's what they did. And so we were very close into most of the fighting that took place. It was quite an education at a number of levels. One thing that you learn after that is how tenuous life is. You come to understand that you can lose it at any minute, and we saw how that worked all the way up the road to Baghdad.
Okay, so that's obviously what you bring to the table. Now let's talk about this most recent article that you've written in celebration and recognition, I guess you would say, of these now 15 years since the invasion of Iraq. It's called Ex-POW Looks for Fresh Start 15 Years After Iraq. And I just want to talk about how we're going to hear some audio clips of interviews during this conversation. You recorded them while researching this story, and it's important to point out they have been edited for both time and content. We'll get to one of those here in a moment. This article focuses around retired Army Chief Warrant Officer 4 Dave Williams. Why did you decide to focus on this individual?
Well, I knew Dave. I've known him a long time. We wrote about the deep attack that he was involved in 14 years ago. We went back to Iraq. We interviewed many of the pilots that were involved in that battle, they came from Fort Hood and from Illesheim, Germany. And most of those pilots were still in Iraq. So we went up there to Balad, which is north of Baghdad. We sat down and interviewed them for weeks. I sat there talking with one pilot after another. Nobody knew much about this battle. It was not well publicized, even though there were embedded reporters, one from the Washington Post. It just did not get any attention. It turns out to have been one of the real disasters of the war, and the only thing that made it salvageable was the pilots. These pilots were incredibly brave. They went into an attack deep into Iraq on the fourth night of the war. Dave Williams was part of the group that came from Fort Hood, and they flew up 4 different routes. Far from where I was at, I was outside Najaf, and they had a base just south of me. And they were basically caught in an insurgent trap that was very much like all the insurgent traps that the Vietnamese had done all those years before in Vietnam, during the Vietnam War. And there was one pilot there named Lance McElhaney who had flown in Vietnam who said that that was what they were going to run into. Nobody believed him except for the pilots who actually were in his unit. They did believe him, and they learned how to fight in that environment. By the time they got back, almost all the helicopters had been shot up. Almost every single helicopter had sustained serious damage. 3 out of the 30 helicopters, or so, somewhere in that number, 3 or 4, those were the ones that could fly the next day. All the rest of them were so damaged they really couldn't fly. They had to use duct tape to basically patch up all the rotor blades that were shot up. So this was an immense shock to a lot of people that the Iraqis could fight that well. And there were thousands of people on the ground. Lance McElhaney had predicted that 4 helicopter crews would be shot down. So there are 2 members of each crew flying an Apache gunship. So what he's talking about is 8 prisoners of war, or possibly even 8 soldiers killed. And by some amazing, just some amazing thing that happened here, only 1 helicopter was shot down, and that's the one that Dave Williams flew, along with Chief Warrant Officer 2 Ronald Young. Both of them were CW-2s at the time. They were shot down. They were quickly captured, and then they became prisoners and held with a group of other prisoners that were captured outside of Nasiriyah. They were members of the 507th Maintenance Company, which had gone into Nasiriyah by mistake. It was just a bad decision. The guy went right instead of left at the fork. And these people, Saddam Fedayeen, who were fanatical fighters, we saw them all the way to Baghdad. They never backed down from a fight, even when they were outnumbered. And the Saddam Fedayeen got into a firefight with the 507th. They killed 11 soldiers with the maintenance company, and then they captured 6 of them, and then Dave and Ron made 8. So they had been held captive for 3 weeks, with the exception of Jessica Lynch, who was rescued early. She was in a hospital. But Dave became the senior ranking officer of these prisoners of war, and they all became pretty close, and he basically gave them one order through the entire time they were together, which was, you will stay together, you will stay in touch after we get back. And they did. And so what we did was, we went to El Paso, where Dave was getting married. It's his second marriage. And Shoshana Johnson, who lives in El Paso, one of the prisoners, was there for the wedding. And when you see the story, you'll see a great picture of her hugging Dave. They are just wonderful people. They've been through a great deal. And as you'll see in the story, their post-traumatic stress lives on in many, many ways. 15 years later, sometimes it might as well be an hour ago.
And let's now take a listen to a clip of your interview with who you just mentioned, Shoshana Johnson, discussing what it's like coming back from war.
I guess it's a catch-22. Yeah, we went to war, we survived, and we come back different. It doesn't mean that we're invincible. I think sometimes you think, oh, you're so strong, you survived it and everything. It doesn't mean we're invincible. We still hurt, and we can still be hurt. Sometimes more easily than before we left. Sometimes I think it's the littlest things that hurt us more.
And yet this goes back to something I said earlier. Once you've been through this, you know you're strong. You know you can endure.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like that all the time?
Not all the time. Not all the time. Sometimes you feel like you're just going to break. But then you find the strength and you pick yourself up and you keep on going. But Lord, sometimes it would be nice to have somebody share the weight. That's what I hope Lulu can be for Dave. Someone to help him share the weight. Because he carries a lot with him. He carries a lot. And I really wish he would let some of it go. But I don't think he can.
You don't think he can let go?
Big Daddy got to be Big Daddy.
And so we just heard a clip of your interview with Shoshana Johnson, who was an Army cook. She was a POW with the man we're talking about now, who also, as you just mentioned, recently got married. And some of those photos are available in this story at expressnews.com. It was a ceremony at the Santa Fe Bridge linking El Paso and Juarez. It's his second marriage and came just before what we are now discussing, the 15th anniversary of the Iraq War. Tell me about this marriage.
Dave and Lulu have known each other for 2 years. Lulu lives in Juarez. Dave has lived in El Paso for many, many years. Dave was married. He has 2 kids, and they're both teenagers now. And Dave came out of that marriage with a lot of post-traumatic stress, and the story doesn't get too deeply in it. We may end up doing some blogs about this, but Dave had some serious post-traumatic stress issues that I think contributed to his divorce. But Lulu has been a real godsend to him. He talks about that in the story. She is at his side all the time. He has bad days, and I mean that in the plural. So there will be days where he can't go to sleep, literally 2-3 days in a row where he doesn't go to sleep. And finally, he collapses. There have been times when he used Ambien too much in a desperate bid to try to sleep. There are a lot of other issues, one of which is one of his captors is still out there sending threatening messages to his Facebook account.
This is... I'm completely caught off guard. Tell me about that.
They call the man Raymond because they said he looks like Ray Romano from Everybody Likes Raymond. I don't really watch that show, but I have an idea what he looks like. And this guy was one of the captors, and I'm told that he was one of the nicer ones. But he has been in touch with all of the former captives at some point or another, and I was surprised that he was able to get a hold of their of these folks. But he would send them Facebook messages. He may be sending them messages in some other medium, for all I know, including email. But at first, he was asking for money. Later, he started getting threatening. And Dave has routed these messages into a file on his phone called Important. And the FBI is involved, so they're investigating. But I don't know what anybody's going to be able to do about it. The guy lives in Iraq, and he is probably not going to be prosecuted or extradited to the United States. And in fact, I was with him on Fort Bliss one day when he was going through the phone, and I said, "You're kidding me." I said, "You've got a guy who's out there from Iraq, one of your captors, who's still in contact with you, and he's threatening you?" And he said, "Yeah." And that is one reason why I did not name his first wife, and I didn't name his kids, and I didn't say where they're living. I don't want them put into any jeopardy. I even had some concerns about identifying Lulu's kids. We ended up doing that for the photos. But, you know, when you've got somebody out there stalking you like that, it can be a concern, and it definitely bothers Dave Williams a lot. And it bothers me.
Yeah, that is absurd. Wow, that is a very interesting detail in this story. Hopefully some good news on that front that you'll be able to report in the future, with the FBI being involved and obviously Dave keeping track of those messages. So, okay, maybe we'll hear more on that down the road. Let's get back to, as you mentioned, the PTSD. You thought that had perhaps something to do with the end of his first marriage. This is now his second marriage that we've been talking about. Let's take a listen to some audio of an interview you did with Dave Williams and his new wife talking about his PTSD and his trouble sleeping. Let's hear that exchange.
Since I came back from Iraq, in the last 15 years, lately I've been able to sleep for at least several hours a night. Okay, but there's been times where I'll go week, like not this week, but like last week, I'll go 2 days or 3 days with no sleep at all until I finally just collapse and go to sleep.
The Ambien doesn't always help anyway, does it?
No. And it's probably the worst substance the Army could ever prescribe me.
Why?
Because, unfortunately, it's a hypnotic classification of medication, and you do things that you like, whether it's driving, cooking, or stuff that you shouldn't be doing while taking it. You know, you wake up, but you don't realize you're awake. You know, and I owe my life to Lourdes because she has, for the past 2 years, she's lived that wave up and down with me, and she's helped me mitigate and minimize those experiences.
Lourdes, how do you do that? How have you helped him?
I try to keep him the right way to stop to take the Ambien.
I'm back now with Sig Christenson. We're talking about his article, Ex-POW Looks for Fresh Start 15 Years After Iraq. He was embedded with U.S. forces 15 years ago during the invasion of Iraq. He's written about it quite a few times since then. This is the most recent for the San Antonio Express-News. Talking about Dave Williams, Sig, we've talked about his PTSD, talked about how he became a prisoner of war. Now his second marriage, where he had some of those fellow prisoners of war visit him and attend that wedding. But he, as you mentioned earlier, Sig, he had a leadership position amongst this group, and they actually called him Big Daddy because he looked after them like a dad. Tell me about that.
Dave is a very conscientious individual. He feels responsible for all of those prisoners. He was the ranking officer, so he was responsible for getting them home. And so they recognize how intensely he feels about this subject, and that's why they call him Big Daddy Dave. He still is constantly worried about them, asking about them. They talk to each other. Shoshana told me, for example, that she'll talk to Jessica Lynch, who was one of the worst injured of the prisoners of war, and they'll talk about all kinds of things that cross their minds or cross the transcript of life in America. It doesn't necessarily have to be about the war. But they do keep in touch, and he feels very, very strongly about it. And I suspect that is part of his PTSD. He has a great sense of responsibility. You know, when he went down in that helicopter, he was in charge. He had to make the decisions. Every decision you make when you're about to be captured is a life and death decision. If you, for example, make the wrong decision, you do the wrong thing, you can get yourself killed very quickly. The first hour of your capture is probably going to determine whether you live or die. And it's something we were taught in Centurion. It's something that they are taught as well. And so he made every right decision once they were on the ground. And it could have gone the other way. It doesn't take much. And then when they were prisoners, they were beaten, sometimes severely. So Dave, for example, has traumatic brain injury that was caused by the Iraqis beating him in the head with the butts of their AK-47 rifles. And unfortunately, I'm told that Ron Young, his co-pilot, has the same problems, that he was hit in the head like that as well. All of these prisoners were beaten. They were abused to some degree. And like prisoners in every war, they didn't eat the best food. Sometimes they didn't eat. So, you know, he's the guy in charge. And I'll tell you how seriously he takes this. So we're working really late on the Friday night in Juarez, and he's just at the end of the day. And you can tell in this interview that he's tired, that he's getting run down, and that he's getting stressed out. Remembering all this stuff is taking a toll on him. And so he took me to the border, and he gave me $20 to make sure I could get back. I didn't ask for the money. I didn't really want to take it, but he said, take it if you need it. Make sure you have it so you get home. That's Dave right there in a nutshell. He'll get his $20 back, but I'll tell you what, that's who he is. He wants to take care of you. He feels responsible for you. And if something happened to you, his conscience would not bear that well. That's Dave Williams.
One thing that you mentioned earlier, Sig, that I want to kind of circle back on was that the opening days of the Iraq War 15 years ago, if you will, were about the only things that seemed to go well or go as planned. After that, we know about, you know, the mission accomplished banner and all the POWs and the continued issues that are going on with Iraq and Afghanistan. We've discussed all that. But one of the things that I'm sure you're well aware of, I'm not telling you anything, that has not gone well, has not gone according to plan, is how we treat our veterans and how we treat our POWs, and how we take care of them. Do you know, based on your conversations with David Williams, what his relationship is like with the government at this point? Are his medical needs being taken care of? Is he receiving compensation to make sure that, you know, he has the money to buy the things that he needs for himself and his family? What's his relationship like with the military after being a POW, after being shot down, and then coming back now 15 years on?
I wish I could tell you. I know that there were some problems at one point with his VA check, and we did not discuss that, and I got the sense that he didn't really want to go there. And so when I'm in a situation like that, I tend to back away. Unless you're really wanting to talk about something, I'm not going to push you. He struck me at times as being in a fairly frazzled state. I mean, let's just remember, on his wedding day, he did not smile very much. Shoshana noticed it, and I noticed it. I thought he looked preoccupied, and I thought he was tired, and I pretty much guessed that he might have slept 2 or 3 hours the night before. That's just what I was seeing, and I have an understanding of that. I have those nights too. I have days when I don't sleep well, and I think I know how I look, and I sure know how I feel. And so I wish I could tell you that, but I can tell you this in general. one of the great failures of the war and of this whole era is that so many people went there, not just once, but 2 and 3 times, sometimes 4. We spent time in 2007 and 8 with soldiers who had been in the war zone 4 times and more. And they had, in some cases, hardly seen their families over the 5 or 6 years of that conflict. It was shocking to find the number of people that we did who had done 3 and then 4 tours. And they were doing something that we had never seen American soldiers do before. They were returning again and again and again, often to the same places, often to the same bases, and going out and running patrols on the same roads, patrols where they had lost friends in the previous tour, patrols where they had scraped what was left of their friends off the inside of their tanks. This is a bit gruesome, but it's absolutely all true. And then they come back. And what happened? Well, more than a few of them drank, and they drank a lot. Some of them abused substances. Some smoked pot. Some took other drugs. Some did high-risk activities, riding motorcycles at high rates of speed. And they would basically live these lifestyles and stress out their families. Now, I'm going to say that many soldiers probably did a fairly good job of holding together, but we found people who did not. And it's a sad thing, because I think that the Army was well aware of how difficult the war was proving for people. And I don't think the Army did as good a job as it could have in terms of helping them manage their mental health. And part of that wasn't really the Army's fault. Part of that was the fact that you couldn't get enough psychiatrists to work for the Army. You couldn't get enough psychologists to work at Fort Hood, for example. And so, quite frequently, the doctors would prescribe pills. Well, one of the things that the Army discovered around 2008 was that wasn't really working so well. And they started trying to draw back on prescribing medications that especially were powerful, like psychotropic medications. And that, I think, then filtered onto the VA, which has some of the same problems the Army does. How do you draw a psychiatrist to work for the VA when you can't pay them more than $70,000 or $80,000 in Boston? Does anybody have an idea of what the cost of living is in Boston and what a psychiatrist working in private practice can earn? The fact is that there just aren't enough psychiatrists and psychologists out there to start with. And so the problem was bigger than the Army and the VA. And what I think most Americans have not really come to grasp, simply because they don't know many people in the military, is that we have a lot of folks out there who've gone to war a number of times. Dave, by the way, went back to Iraq in 2006 and flew combat again. And lots of people did that. And what we've done is we've stressed out not just one generation of troops, but we're now getting to the point where we're going to stress out a new generation of troops. The war is going on, 2001, it's going on its 17th year in Afghanistan. And we're back in Iraq. And I'll tell you what, we're not going to leave. We're not leaving either one of those places anytime soon. This is going to become a generational war, where Sergeant Snuffy's son, who was 3 years old on 9/11, is going to be serving in Afghanistan next year, because we know from just from the numbers that a lot of people who serve in the Army, their kids end up serving in the Army, or they go into another service branch. That's a subject that we wrote about earlier in the year, and it's a trend that people have observed for a long time. So we have a problem, And we also have an obligation to help those folks out any way we can. While many of us didn't go, we watched it on television. These people went not once, not twice, but 3 times and 4 times. And people in special operations, you can find people who went 10 times and 12 times. It's extraordinary. Nobody ever did that in any other war. This one, it's a different war entirely, and we've asked a lot of our troops.
I've been speaking with Sig Christenson. He is the author of the article we're discussing, but of course we're expanding upon just that content itself. It's called Ex-POW Looks for Fresh Start 15 Years After Iraq, talking about the man we've also been discussing, Dave Williams, now in his second marriage. And we heard from Dave earlier in a clip, and also Shoshana Johnson, a fellow POW who was at that wedding that just took place recently as well. And of course, Sig was there. Sig, we're going to have to end now. This has been a very great conversation. Thank you so much for joining me. You just gave some really nice final thoughts, but I just want to give you one more chance. Final thoughts about Dave, final thoughts about 15-year anniversary of Iraq before we say goodbye.
One of the things I've seen on Facebook this week and Twitter are people talking about how this war happened, how it was a mistake. Somebody said something about how we destroyed Iraq. And I was on Twitter a couple of days ago and saw something that people in the military are familiar with, Doctrine Man, who wrote, "Having spent several years of my life in Iraq, I don't think we destroyed the country. But we are guilty of missing the golden hour and not understanding how a complex problem basically could be solved." And I wrote back, "Iraq was broken when the 3rd ID and Marines arrived in the country. The problem was Iraqis who supported our presence there expected a great deal of the United States, and those who conceived the invasion were clueless of what to do next. There were other issues, but that was the biggest. So I'll tell you, we went there without a Phase 4 plan. We had no idea of what to do about transforming that country's government into something that could work. And, of course, the first thing that the ambassador did there, whether this was his decision or not, was basically fire the Iraqi army. He disbanded it because it had Baathists in it. And it was a gross misunderstanding of how Saddam built the Ba'ath Party to begin with, and it was the biggest single mistake of the entire war. We had people out there who would have worked for us, and they would have come back under a reconstituted Iraqi army and would have worked with us and had been supportive of us. Once we got rid of them, and we basically shamed them by saying, your army is rotten and corrupt and we want nothing to do with it, they took up arms against us. That was the Ba'athist insurgency that ensued. And the shame of it is that it led to years of destabilization in Iraq. Destabilization that, by the way, still exists. And so I would tell everybody who listens to this podcast, you've got to really think about where the war has gone and where it will go. Because what we've done is we have basically invaded 2 countries, but neither government there has been successful at fixing the problems. In fact, the Iraqi government and the Afghan government have been horribly corrupt organizations. And the militaries that we've created and trained have failed. What that means is we're going to have to be there a lot longer. And it's a shame because you just have no earthly idea how many more years we're going to have to be at this before we can even take a breath and hope that the government in Baghdad and the government in Kabul can stand up and run their country without our help. And that's a scary thought. I mean, your son today in high school could be in the Army 3 years from now and fighting there. I don't think the American people had any earthly idea when this started that we would be in that place today. But that's where we are. And then on top of that, you've got a whole generation of troops who have physical ailments and emotional problems. And they all stem from the war. the next time we go to war, I hope people think long and hard about what that means, because wars never go the way you think they will. And they always have more casualties than you ever can imagine. Dave is doing what he can to make his life good again. And I hope Lulu is a big part of the solution. But there are no guarantees. And that's kind of the scary part. We're all out there talking to each other and helping each other and hoping that things go well. But then some days you get a call and you say somebody mysteriously died or someone killed themselves. And you see conversations like that on Facebook all the time. Veterans who know veterans, a story comes up, and the grieving never ends. So it's a really serious thing, and I have to tell you that when I think of Iraq, I always think of that. There's a lot of grief to go around here for anybody who was involved in it, and we all hope that some good comes of it. But it's a long, strange road we've gone down, and the road there's no real sight for the end of that road.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
No, thank you for being on here. San Antonio Express News senior reporter Sig Christenson, thank you for joining me today. And I'll go and say thank you for everything that you've done, all the reporting that you've done, and of course, going to Iraq, and it's great because your voice, what we've discussed here today, I think can have the effect that you just talked about. When you think of Iraq, think of the people who are with us, who were there 3, 4 more times. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, and I have several friends who served in Iraq and Afghanistan multiple times. And when I think of Iraq and when I think of Afghanistan, I think of them and I think of their lives now. And I think that's perhaps an ongoing tribute, enduring tribute that we can have for these conflicts, is to think about the people who are still with us and those we have lost, but the people who are still with us who are dealing with these issues like Dave Williams. So, Sig Christenson, once again, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, sir.
And of course, big thanks to San Antonio Express News senior reporter Sig Christenson. Thank you for joining me for today's episode of In Depth, brought to you by expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Storland.